Welcome, everyone. My name is Wendy Sukier, and I'm the Academic Director of the Women Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub. Just give us a few moments. We'll give people a chance to get online, and we will start shortly. Thank you. Okay, there may be people who jump in as we move through the program, but I think it's a couple minutes after and we only have an hour, so we'll get going. As I said, my name is Wendy Sukier and I lead the Women Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub, which has 10 hubs across the country and many partners focused on advancing opportunities for women and diverse entrepreneurs by strengthening the innovation and entrepreneurship ecosystem. And before we get started, I want to acknowledge that I'm joining you from the traditional unceded territory of the Mississauga of the Credit, the Haudenosaunee, the Chippewa, the Wendat, and the Anishinaabe people here in Toronto. And all of us are settlers on this land if we're not Indigenous peoples. And I encourage all of you to indicate in the chat where you're joining us from today. So one of the things that really motivated our interest in this session is we know how important trade is for expanding opportunities for women entrepreneurs in particular. And we also know procurement offers incredible opportunities to grow markets, customers, and to prosper. And so the purpose of this seminar is to understand better how those two things intersect. And before we move on to range of interesting speakers we have here today, Caroline Landry, who's the Executive Director at the Strategic Policy Sector at Public Services and Procurement Canada with the Government of Canada, is going to talk about government procurement obligations under our international trade agreements. And I have to say, Caroline has been really at the forefront of driving change to create more opportunities and build capacity for women entrepreneurs. So over to you, Caroline.
Great, thank you so much, Wendy. I'm going to attempt to share my screen. So if you'll bear with me for a moment. And okay. Can anybody see this?
Perfect.
Great. So thanks again. I am here today to go over the Government of Canada's procurement obligations under Canada's trade agreements. So the purpose. I think we all know the purpose of trade agreements is to help foster global competition and innovation by enabling Canadian suppliers to compete on a more level playing field with firms in other countries. Now, that being said, that means trade agreements greatly expand the potential marketplace for Canadian goods and services because we have access to other foreign government procurements for Canadian suppliers. But on the flip side, they also have access to our procurement opportunities. So it's a two-way street. Next slide. This is one of my favorite slides. I call this my cheat sheet slide. So this is where we list all 12 of the trade agreements that contain substantive obligations for government procurement activities. So we call those procurement chapters. You'll see we've divided it. There's one that is internal trade only, so only for Canadian within Canada. And then the others are international trade agreements, which are between Canada and the other countries or trade blocs. And then on the other side, we've also divided it where you'll see where there's ones that cover federal, provincial, territorial, and municipal. And then there's others that cover just federal, provincial, and territorial, and not municipal. And then the ones that cover just federal only. So here are all the names. Generally, the jargon, I'm sure you've heard of them before: CFTA, CETA, Canada, UK, TCA, WTO, AGP, the CPTPP. These are what they're known by, but those are their actual names. The one that you're not going to see here, and some of you might be surprised by this, but because in the news, I'm sure you heard what we call the new NAFTA, which is called the Canada, United States, Mexico Agreement, CUSMA, was put in place last year. So while CUSMA does have a government procurement chapter, that procurement chapter does not apply to Canada. So that's why it's not listed there, but we still have our obligations with the US through the WTO and with Mexico through the CPTPP. So just to clarify that in case you're wondering why it's not there. So the structure of our procurement chapters. So the procurement obligations of all of our trade agreements are very similarly structured, and they have two main components. So the procedural rules, I call this the how-tos. This is exactly how you're going to do it. They describe how it's going to be conducted, all the rules, the technical specs, notices, bid periods, bid challenge, all of those things. And they also describe certain exceptions to the usual rules. On the market access obligation side, you've probably heard referred to as Canada's market access schedules. So they indicate which procurements are subject to procedural rules of the trade agreement by setting out the covered entities and commodities. This slide goes over how do we decide, because people say, gee, Caroline, this sounds really complicated. How do you know which one is covered? Or, you know, how do you folks do your jobs in procurement? So again, not all procurements are subject or covered, as they say, by Canada's trade agreements. But these are the easy steps that we use to decide if a procurement is covered by a trade agreement. So number one, is the total estimated value equal or greater than the relevant threshold? And I have a slide following this one on the thresholds. Is the end user entity covered, as in the department who's going to be receiving the goods or service? Are they covered? Is the commodity covered? And number four, are there any exclusions? Are there no exclusions applicable? So all four of them must be met in order for the procurement to be covered by the applicable trade agreement. And we also have lots of checklists and things that we use as well, but this is the simplified version. So thresholds, I always have this actually right next to my desk at all times. So these are the thresholds. You will note that they are good until December 2023. That's because they were just refreshed at the end of December. These thresholds are refreshed every 2 years. So for procurement to be subject to a trade agreement, the total estimated value is equal or greater than the applicable threshold. So you'll notice it covers goods, services, and construction. You'll see the lowest threshold for goods is under CFTA. The lowest threshold for services is under the Canada-Korea Free Trade Agreement. And then again, the lowest for construction is under CFTA. You'll also note construction for all of the rest are $9.1 million. So there's a bit of a difference between the one for CFTA and the international trade agreements. All right, coverage in a nutshell, what you need to know. So all trade agreements, vast majority of federal departments and agencies are covered. If you need an example, what's not covered? CSIS. CSIS would not be covered under the trade agreements, as we can all understand. Coverage of the rest, so the federal crowns, provinces and territories varies between trade agreements. For goods, in general, this is an easy one. All goods are covered by all TAs unless there's exceptions. Services, the CFTA covers all services. Coverage of services, of course, again, varies between international trade agreements and as well as between federal, provincial, territorial, and municipal entities. Construction, CFTA covers all construction services, and in general, international trade covers all construction services except for dredging services and construction services that are procured by or on behalf of the Department of Transport. So that means anything that Transport buys for dredging services and construction on their own behalf, or anything PSPC, who I work for, on their behalf. Exclusions. TAs do not apply to any procurements where there's an express exclusion exists. And again, you can find those in the procurement chapters. And exclusions usually take the form, you can spot them because they're going to start with this agreement does not cover procurement of, or this chapter does not apply to procurement, etc. You get the idea. Okay, so introduction to the rules. So again, the procurement is covered by a trade agreement, then the procedural rules must be respected. And they are comprehensive and include obligations for essentially all aspects of procurement process. Other than contract administration, we have our own rules around that, which are also very comprehensive. If a procurement is subject to more than one trade agreement, because people ask me all the time, gee, this is really confusing, Caroline, like what if it's one and it's covered and it's another? Well, all applicable trade agreements must be complied with at the same time. This can be achieved by following the procedural rules of the most rigorous. So if the World Trade Organization Agreement, the WTO on government procurement, is one of those that apply, you can bet, because it's the most rigorous, if you comply with those rules, then that means all the rest would be covered as well, because you're more than covering. Non-discrimination, that is the theme of this slide. The core principle of government procurement procedural rules is non-discrimination. So that means Canadian firms are treated no more favorably than our trade partners, suppliers, and the same inverse. So they are treated no less favorably than we would treat Canadian suppliers. So again, this would include domestic suppliers based on a degree of foreign affiliation or ownership by Canadian trade partners. So it's all covered. The trade agreements also prohibit offsets. So offsets are any condition or undertaking that encourages local domestic development, such as the use of domestic content. So you've all heard about Canadian content policy. Next slide. Okay, so again, continuing with our non-discrimination. So barring the invocation or application of certain limited exceptions for set-asides, the non-discrimination and offset provisions mean that, so Canadian content, I just mentioned, domestic content preferences and requirements for Canadian benefits are prohibited in procurements that are subject to any international trade agreements, and local preferences and benefits are prohibited in procurements that are subject to any trade agreement. So, and again, that's across the board. So when a procurement is covered by the CFTA, the Canadian Free Trade Agreement only, Canadian content requirements may be applied so long as those requirements comply with Canadian content provisions in the CFTA and are applied in a manner otherwise consistent with the CFTA obligations, and don't discriminate between provinces. So you can't have Canadian content that would say, oh, this has to have been, this must come from Alberta versus, it has to come from Newfoundland. So it cannot discriminate between provinces, territories, and regions. Overview of the procedural rules. So again, the order of business here is open, fair, transparent, and competitive. So the key procedural rules of trade agreements include, so the publishing the bid solicitation in the government's designated tendering website. So that's the government electronic tendering service, which is called buyandsell.gc.ca. So that's where you're going to see all of the published solicitations. To note, we will be transitioning to Canada Buys in the future. I don't have an exact date for you, but stay tuned. You'll find out more information on that, and it will be very well publicized. Also providing bidders with a reasonable time to respond to their bid solicitation. Rule of thumb, with respecting in general the international trade agreements, the time is usually between 15 to 40 days. That's your range, depending on the trade agreement that's applicable. And providing all information necessary for responsive tenders in the tender documentation. So that means everybody gets the same at the same time. You can't post one thing one day and then something else that was added on later. That starts the clock ticking at the start for your 15 to 40 day minimum. Evaluating all bids fairly according to the rules set out in the tender documentation. So this means, of course, we have all of our procurement rules that are excuse me there. My son just walked in my room, even though I had do not disturb on the sign. Anyway, so make sure it's all fair. And just to note, as an example, when you are putting in criteria where you say the procurement is for X amount of this good or service, let's say it's tissue. You can't say Kleenex, you need to say tissue or facial tissue, or say Kleenex if that's the only name people know, or equivalent. So it's to make sure everything is fair and open, that it's not something that's just specific to a specific brand. At the federal level, many procurement procedural rules found in the trade agreements also exist under regulations. So example, our government contract regulations. And of course, our laws, our policies, all of these must be respected, even where trade agreements do not apply. So just because something is covered by a trade agreement doesn't mean all the other rules don't come into play. Okay, challenge mechanism. So we have the Canadian International Trade Tribunal. So if a company feels that we haven't respected our obligations under the trade agreements, they can file a complaint with the Canadian International Trade Tribunal, CITT. So CITT will determine if that complaint is valid. It may recommend remedies such as reevaluating the bids, terminating the contract, or compensating the complainant for lost profits. So we put thousands of procurements out every year, and I'm happy to say we have very few challenges from that are filed with CITT. So, but that's where you go if you need to go. If it is for CFTA, they have a separate process, but for the international ones, it's CITT. Okay, so this is the fun parts. So flexibilities. So trade agreements do contain flexibilities that in certain circumstances, and I should have underlined that, certain circumstances can allow for deviations from the normal procedural rules or permit contracting officers to remove a procurement entirely from the obligations of the applicable trade agreements. So I think we probably all, understand the urgency provision. Something is super urgent, the minimum bid period can be reduced to a minimum of 10 days if there is a state of urgency. The national security exception is one that allows Canada to remove procurements from all the obligations under the trade agreements where Canada considers it necessary to do so in order to protect its national security interests. And in the last 2 years, you can certainly see that we've had a number of those. With what's been going on, and Indigenous carve-outs. So all trade agreements include a provision that permits for measures to be taken to benefit Indigenous peoples and businesses. So relying on or invoking trade agreement flexibilities, please note, does not remove a procurement or permit deviations from other applicable regulations, policies, and procedures. So again, that the framework that is around procurement, public procurement that we have at the federal level, they all are still in place. Okay, other flexibilities. So key procurement initiatives and priorities are permissible within trade agreement context. For example, green procurement, there are some trade agreements that have green aspects that you can include. And for the social, we have, so although many social procurements are prohibited by trade agreements, because you just heard me say that earlier, there are both exceptions and exclusions that Canada will rely on for different aspects of social procurement initiative. And although trade agreements do not prohibit accessibility requirements, they do ask that they are standardized, and that they're based on international standards. So it can't be an accessibility criteria that's just specifically Canadian and is not standardized. And then for vendor performance, where there's evidence, supporting evidence, trade agreements do allow for us to exclude suppliers from competition due to significant or persistent deficiencies in performance of any substantive requirement or obligation under prior contracts. So, but again, all of that has to be well substantiated and kept on file. So I think I have gone over my time by 2 minutes, so I apologize, Wendy. I know we're going to be covering a few things at our panel with some questions, and we're going to talk a little bit more about, I believe, social procurement there. So I'm going to leave it there, and thank you for your time.
Thank you. I just wanted to note there were a couple of questions that are sort of specific to your presentation. So maybe before we go to the panel, we can take a couple of those. The one is just, and I know we'll hear more about the other side of this, but just flagging that people are interested in what the opportunities are for women entrepreneurs to navigate procurement with foreign governments. So, many are struggling to navigate with the Canadian government. So some discussion, I think, in the panel about what those opportunities are. And
I could have put a plug in my presentation for, we do have Procurement Access Canada, which is part of PSPC, which is there to help suppliers, vendors navigate the procurement process, can actually help you find those opportunities. But we can talk more about that at the panel.
Yes. And the other hot pursuit was just to define MASH.
So that is municipal, hospital.
It's MUSH. Municipal, university, social, and hospital. Yeah, there you go.
I shorten it to municipalities, but it's kind of everything. Yes, universities, hospitals.
Publicly funded.
Yes, publicly funded. Yes, you are exactly right. Yeah.
And then we have another question that I think I'll hold on for the panel, but thank you so much. That was kind of a deep dive. And can I assume that we can make the PowerPoint presentation available after?
Absolutely. And I'm sure you'll be able to make my email available to the participants. Me and my team would be very happy to answer any more deep dive, because again, these are comprehensive. I just scratched the surface. There's so much more. So if there is something very specific that anyone would like to know, we'd be happy to provide that answer.
So Caroline has provided a quick overview of the trade agreements and how they impact what the Canadian government and other levels of government can and cannot do with respect to procurement. Now we're going to be joined for a few introductory remarks by Nadine Nickner, who's the Director of Government Procurement with Trade and Environment at Global Affairs Canada, and she'll talk more about the opportunity side of this. So over to you, Nadine.
Thank you, Wendy. And thank you, Caroline, for this comprehensive presentation on Canada's government procurement obligations in our trade agreements. So I'm pleased to be here today to discuss the complex window of opportunities that government procurement market access provides to Canadian businesses. Government procurement commitments form part of Canada's approach to any comprehensive free trade agreement. So in all of our FTA negotiations, Canada seeks to secure preferential access of our trading partners' government procurement markets, while at the same time maintaining the necessary domestic policy space to achieve environmental and social economic objectives. So according to the World Trade Organization, government procurement market accounts for 10 to 15% of a country's gross domestic product, so GDP. So in an economy like Canada, we're talking about billions of dollars that are spent by governments at the federal, provincial, municipal, territorial, municipal levels to purchase goods, services, and construction services. So the government procurement chapters that we seek to negotiate in our trade agreement support the primary objective of providing Canadian businesses, including small businesses and women-owned businesses, with increased access to government procurement opportunities in foreign countries. So, for example, and Caroline talked a little bit about some of the free trade agreements that we have and mentioned that this slide, she really likes this slide. So if we were talking about the WTO agreement on government procurement, that agreement provides Canadian goods, services, and suppliers with guaranteed access to procurement opportunities in 47 WTO members market. So that includes like the US, the UK, Japan, and the European Union and its 27 member states. So it's a significant opportunity. As mentioned by Caroline, Canada's GP chapter include procedural rules to ensure that new procurement opportunities are conducted in accordance with the principle of non-discrimination, fairness, transparency, and accountability. And those procedural rules tend to be very similar from one agreement to the other. But the gold standard right now is the WTO GPA. In addition, I think it's really important to talk a little bit about this. Canada also negotiates provisions that we sometimes call carve-outs or exemption or exceptions that allow the government to develop and implement domestic procurement policies that benefit small and medium-sized enterprises, women, minority-owned businesses, or underrepresented groups. So for example, in all of Canada's FTAs, we include a provision that excludes any measures adopted or maintained with respect to Indigenous peoples. So such exemption gives Canada the flexibility to implement set-aside programs, such as the procurement strategy for Indigenous businesses. Now, there's also another exception or carve out for measures adopted or maintained to benefit Canadian micro and small businesses. So that again can include women-owned small businesses. And this is something that exists in most of our agreements. So should Canada wish to develop and implement such a set-aside program in the future, we have the flexibility to do so. As it relates to one of the last slides from Caroline's presentation, talked a little bit about green procurement, social procurement, accessibility. So as it relates to sustainable procurement, while the use of offset is prohibited in our government procurement chapters, there's always ways in which social and green procurement can be conducted in a manner that is consistent with our trade obligation. And that requires some thinking outside the box, but there is some flexibility there. In our recent trade negotiation, we have strived to include new provisions to clarify that parties, including procuring entities, so when I say parties, I mean Canada and our trading partner country, are not prevented from undertaking policies and programs that support the use of social procurement, for example, provided that they are consistent with the principle of non-discrimination, fairness, transparency, and accountability. So thank you very much. I'll turn it back over to Wendy.
Thank you for that. And I know we'll be digging in more deeply because one of we have a variety of people here, some who are interested in the technical aspects of the agreements and the limitations and what it means for their public procurement, but others who clearly want to know how they can take advantage of the opportunities, and your perspective's really valuable. I'm now pleased, and I'm hoping Caroline can come back on camera. I wanted to introduce Pernille Fischer-Bultz, who is the founder of Kiss Her Up International Trade Routes. And I'll give Pernille a chance to just quickly introduce herself and what her organization does. And Nadine, you've fallen off the camera, so please come back.
Thank you very much, Wendy. Thank you all for having me here today. My name is Pernille Fischer-Bultz. I am the founder and CEO of Kiss Her Up International Trade Routes. We are a women-owned and operated company with a headquarters in Canada, branched in Europe, in Denmark, and one in the Arctic. So we do private sector development. We bid on 80% of our projects are international procurement, public procurement. And we also teach SMEs in about 90 countries around the world how to use trade agreements and how to successfully position yourself for exports. In the interest of time, unless you want more, I'm going to leave it there.
No, that's fantastic. Thank you so much. So I'll start with Caroline, I think initially, and certainly Nadine and Pernille may jump in, but can you talk a little bit more about offsets and set-asides? And we know that currently those apply specifically for Indigenous peoples. And maybe you can talk about, and I think Nadine alluded to this, the opportunity to expand the groups that are able to avail themselves of set-asides.
Right. Thanks. So yeah, I'll try not to repeat what Nadine mentioned, but as I had mentioned earlier, offsets are not allowed. They are prohibited by the trade agreements. So this leaves us with the options for the set-aside. So we know that some of the trade agreements, there's two types of set-asides, the small business set-aside and the minority business set-aside. So those apply to most, although I did want to mention that it does not apply to CETA. CETA only uses, they do not permit the use of set-asides other than the Indigenous, for Indigenous business. So as we mentioned earlier, all trade agreements have this thing that says any measures, which include set-asides or any other types of measures for Indigenous. But there does give us that room for set-asides for minority business and small business. So we have to navigate within the rules of the trade agreements. But as Nadine said, we kind of find the different ways in which we can, it would apply in this one, it wouldn't apply in that one. We have some flexibility. I did bring with me my list of which ones have which have small business set aside. So there are ways. We have to be deliberate, but we are committed to using every way we can in order to make these things possible.
And this, I should have asked you this earlier, but given that the participants come from different backgrounds and have different levels of familiarity and experience in these matters, could you just quickly define what you mean by a set aside and how that would work?
So a set aside is basically a carve out. So you will see if we have a set aside, when we post the procurement, it will say this procurement is set aside for this. That's a complete set aside. You'll see that for the Indigenous. It will say right after the first thing you'll see in the procurement is this procurement is covered by this trade agreement, that trade agreement. Then after that, it will say whether it is set aside. Like I said, the ones you'll normally see is for Indigenous business, or you might see that there are pieces, criteria that are included in the procurement that would require, or say it was for a Black-owned business, for example, or something like that. So I think I've answered your question.
Nadine, did you want to add anything about where you see the opportunities for equity deserving groups in this current regime? And you pointed to some, but I think it warrants elaborating on those more.
Yeah, no, certainly. So I think, with the exception of the CETA agreement, so the Canada-EU agreement and the Canada-UK agreement, because we had to replicate the same agreement when the UK left the EU, we had to come up with a new agreement. We have included, with the exception of those two agreements, we've included set aside, or we have the flexibility to implement new measures that would set aside the obligations of the GP obligations and would allow us the flexibility to develop and implement new programs that would support small businesses. And then it's up to us to define what we mean by a small business. So we also have that flexibility. The US has a set aside program in place. They've had it for many, many years. It's every procurement under $250,000 US is set aside for small and minor-owned businesses, as long as the rule of two is met. So there's at least 2 US companies that are bidding on the procurement. And that program's been in place for a very long time. And Canada could actually do the same. We could implement something very similar. In the US, it's estimated that these contracts below $250,000 US dollars a year, it represents about $1 billion annually. So right now, because those procurements are set aside for American suppliers, Canadian suppliers do not have access to those procurements. Now, Canada could create a very similar program and say, no, we're setting aside all procurements below X amount of 250,000 or maybe 300,000 Canadian, which is roughly probably 250,000 US dollars, are going to be set aside for Canadian small businesses. So we could have a program in place. However, the one thing though, and Caroline made that very clear, is we do not have that flexibility in the context of the EU and the UK. So that would mean that we would have to allow European and British suppliers the opportunity to bid on those procurements. But it would still provide more of an advantage for Canadian companies. And so I'll leave it at that, but I hope that helps a little bit. This is a flexibility that we've had in our trade agreements since NAFTA. So for like around 27, 28 years ago, but we've never actually used it. We did create a set-aside program for Indigenous businesses, but we haven't explored the option of creating
Okay.
one.
And it's really a policy. It sounds like it's really a policy decision. So if I can just paraphrase you, the opportunity would be to say in Canada, anything under 250 is going to be set aside for SMEs, and we could add preferential criteria, presumably for women-led and diverse SMEs within that. And the only limitation would be we would have to allow UK and European countries to also apply. Is that correct?
Yes, so UK and EU companies that are considered also small businesses, and we would have to define what we mean by that, would have access to that. And over the last 2 months, and some people may not know this, but we've been conducting public consultations on potential approaches to implement a reciprocal procurement policies in Canada. And there's 3 approaches that are being discussed, and one of them is actually on the creation of a set-aside program. So that's very much in the current situation where we're at domestically. And so, you know, I would certainly welcome any views on that, and because we, you know,
That's part of the
it's an
reason,
incredible opportunity.
That's part of the reason we wanted to initiate this discussion. And in terms of the policy making decision, is that a joint discussion between Global Affairs and Procurement Canada? Okay.
Certainly, yeah. So we've been working on this reciprocal procurement initiative to explore options, and it's really a whole of government approach. It's in the mandate letter of my minister, Minister Ng, and also Minister Freeland, Deputy Prime Minister Freeland. And so we've been working very closely with Public Service Procurement Canada, with Treasury Board, with Finance, Infrastructure Canada, Transport Canada, because we're really looking at all kinds of different opportunities and approaches to implement a new reciprocal procurement policy in Canada. So it's a whole of government approach.
One last question before I get Pramila to jump in and tell us about the kinds of strategies she thinks SMEs should implement. So you said that the set-aside program in the US results in $1 billion of potential revenue being made available specifically for SMEs and diverse small suppliers. What would the equivalent number be in Canada? Would we assume it's like $100 million, or is there a difference in the potential magnitude of this?
There's certainly a huge difference because the procurement market in the US is much greater than in Canada. I wouldn't be able to give you a number right now because I don't have that information, but it's something that I could follow up and provide more information. Now, we conduct a lot of procurement at the federal level, but where the real procurement takes place is really at the subcentral level. So if the federal government decided to implement a set-aside program at the federal level, and some of the provinces decided to do the same, then it would be a huge opportunity.
And municipalities, because a lot of the services agreements, consulting contracts, and so on would be in that price range. And if you were to say, stay away, big consulting firms, this is money targeting SMEs, that could be transformational. Thank you for that insight. It's so important.
Wendy, I did come prepared with a few numbers because I thought maybe one of the questions would be, well, how much is this all worth here in Canada? So, if you look at federal, provincial, MASH, we're looking at represents about 200 billion a year, approximately, which is like 13% GDP. Now, the government of Canada, on average, depending on if we have any really big purchases, any ships or planes or anything like that, we're averaging around 23 billion per year. Just for us, PSPC, out of that, we do about 17 billion of procurement activity. Now, how are SMEs doing in all of this? So again, I think we're all aware that SMEs make up 98% of all businesses in Canada. And so for us, 46% of our contracts go to, overall, all our contracts, 46% approximately go, 46% go to small business. But if you reduce that to contracts of less than $1 million, we're at 73%. So there is, if you're looking at that runway, there are lots of opportunities, with federal, provincial, and territorial, and MASH. So anyway,
Really helpful.
those are my stats.
Those are helpful stats. It's a big opportunity. And so, Pramila, maybe you can tell us about how SMEs could be taking advantage of these opportunities. And, people from the government, plug your ears, but I do think there's an advocacy opportunity here for sure as well, to really make sure that SMEs are participating in the consultation processes to say, we want a bigger piece of the pie.
Thank you. And thank you for all the numbers and all the information. I do want to start by applauding the federal government for the procurement and the trade agreements as it is today. Many might not know that under CETA, the European agreement, was the first time that the feds actually went out and involved the provinces and the territories. And we are a little firm that is one of those that have benefit from that. I also want to say that it is very possible to win contracts nationally and internationally as the system is today. So if you are a private sector firm sitting out there, don't sit and wait for set-asides or diversity programs to come into place. You can bid today. We bid our first contract in the European Union in 2008, so that's before CETA was signed, for 199,000 euros. That was the threshold, and we were successful in our very first try, probably much to the surprise of everybody. And under CETA, and yes, I have European roots, so this is not why I'm plugging this particularly, but there is a tender database called TED, so not TED Talks, but Tenders Electronic Daily. And the Canadian government did a very good job when they did the CETA agreement of saying we want a one-stop procurement window, which we are underway of having here too, I think at some point. But this covers what we would be the equivalent of federal, provincial, territorial, and municipal procurement in Europe. So I have prepared a few slides that I will share in the resource section after the session here, but there's a link to TED. You can sign up in a procurement database, what kind of procurement you're interested in, the thresholds where you feel comfortable bidding. But I also want to go to the last point on what you can do with the existing databases today. You can go in and see where the awards happened before. You can do that in Government of Canada. You can do that in Europe. So you can actually see who could be a potential partner. In Nova Scotia, we have this beautiful new library, which is on the CNN top 10 list of things to see. It is a partnership under a Canadian engineering firm, a Danish engineering firm, and I think a French architect, I'm not sure the last one. So these people found each other and jointly bid this project. We are receiving inquiries every day. We are placing inquiries to companies in Bangladesh, in Colombia, every day. So this is not the policy side, but if you are out there, you're a private sector, you're sitting in on this call, the Canadian Trade Commissioner Service, Caroline and her office, lots of resources. to participate successfully with the agreements we have today. That was a little longer, Wendy, than it was meant to be, but.
Well, really, today we can only kind of touch the tip of the iceberg and get, I do think that one of the things that's so important about this session is trying to demystify what it actually means to engage both with government procurement and with the opportunities that are being created internationally. I guess the final question I have, because I do know we're running out of time and we have a couple in the chat, is can you talk us through issues of social procurement? And in fact, one of the questions in the chat is around the importance of sustainability and climate change and the extent to which some of those considerations are starting to figure into the discussion, because I would argue that in those respects, the EU is actually ahead of us. And I'm wondering what you're seeing there. Who would like to jump in?
I'll give you a short answer, not on the policy side, but on the private sector side. So one of the things that we're seeing, particularly in the Caribbean and in the EU on procurement there, and we see it with the donors, so the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, the Caribbean Development Bank, that if you start including environmental initiatives, like offering carbon offsets on your travel. Oh, we haven't traveled much in the last couple of years, but if you're starting to put some of those elements in as a competitive advantage, as a value added in your bid, whether it's the full bid, expression of interest, or full bid, these are not necessarily on the evaluation grid, but these are things that can lift your bid in the procurement, because they will come. There will be more. When we're looking at partnering for procurement in countries, in developing countries, on contracts in developing countries, we have a social aspect. So we have a leave behind, we have knowledge transfer in all of our contracts, so in all of our bids. So the local population in the developing countries we're working in will have local ownership once we leave. That's the social part, that's social inclusion. This will create upwards social mobility for the countries that we're working in. So I want to encourage private sector firms who are out there and policymakers at thinking of what you can add that may not necessarily be on the evaluation grid, but will make you more competitive in your bids.
So interesting. Comments about social procurement and what's happening with environmental issues. How about you, Caroline? Anything that you've observed within Canada?
Well, I'll start with the social procurement. So this will be a shameless plug, but I just wanted to do a little bit of bragging that last May, PSPC implemented the policy on social procurement. So this policy is going to allow us to create programs under certain trade agreements. We're going to follow all the rules, remember, that will allow us to set them aside. So to that effect, PSPC is developing a supplier diversity program, which will include supplier diversity, small business set aside component. It will outline exactly how this will all be set aside and how it's all eligible and all that. And also to note that, the supplier diversity program will operate in a manner similar to the set-asides in place under the procurement strategy for Indigenous business. So we are getting there. The first step was to put our policy in place, which then gave us the policy cover in order to develop all these things. But everything that we do is going to be within the context of the trade agreements. But we do have some of those flexibilities, like I had in the programs in my presentation. So anyway, I'm sure Nadine can probably add something to that, but that's where we're headed. So stay tuned. We'll be happy to share more as things develop.
Nadine.
Yeah, no, so I would say that, our international trade agreements present a tremendous opportunity But we recognize, and we've seen this in the last few years, that we need to ensure that all segments of society are able to benefit from them. And so we're really looking at the government procurement chapter and other chapters, in fact, in the free trade agreement with a different lens and focusing on equity seeking groups, including women, small businesses, minority-owned businesses. In recent years, we've been actively engaged in discussions in ongoing FTA negotiations and at the WTO work program on sustainable procurement to see how we can incorporate sustainable procurement, social procurement, green procurement, ethical procurement, and how we can do so in a manner that is consistent with our trade obligations. So there's a lot of work that still needs to be done in that regard, but we are making progress. And increasingly, in our new negotiations, we're trying to incorporate new language on sustainable procurement to make it very clear and provide legal certainty that it's okay to incorporate these social, economic, environmental consideration. Because in the past, in the WTO, we mentioned the environment in 2 locations in our agreement. So that's not much. Nowadays, we should actually be talking about climate change. We should be talking about supply chain. We should be talking about labor consideration, social economic consideration. So I think moving on, we will be doing that. The fact that it's not included in our GP chapter does not prevent us from doing so. But I think in the past, there's been some serious concerns that, oh, if we input this, we're going to be challenged. We're going to have to go through the Canadian International Trade Tribunal. We don't want to do that. So now by including language, I think that will provide that legal certainty and also raise awareness that, yeah, it's okay. We're spending 15% of our GDP. Let's use that to support our climate change objectives. Why can't we create criteria to encourage low carbon embedded construction material? So it's not happening overnight, but we are moving in that direction. And there's incredible potential. And I would say that Canada, over the last few years, yes, we're not the #1 country most advanced in this area, but we have made some amazing strides. And we are really moving in the right direction.
I think that's such a good point. And the last thing that I just wanted somebody to quickly address, and we've only got a couple of minutes left, is the relationship between opportunities that are being afforded for tier 1 suppliers versus the opportunities that SMEs might be able to engage in as tier 2 suppliers. And maybe, Pramila, you're nodding your head. Maybe you can just quickly explain that idea.
Yeah, so tier 1 suppliers would be those of us who contract directly with an entity, whether it's a national or a foreign. And tier 2 suppliers would be those who are then selling to us or others who engage directly. We are seeing a lot of policy speculations abroad towards only allowing WBOs or women-owned businesses with a shareholder 51% or more being certified to bid on contract, that could then prevent some from participating or negate them to participate in tier 2. But I want to raise a concern there because particular post-pandemic, lots of women-owned businesses have taken on financing that might have diluted them not to be majority business owner, but still being sustainable. But tier 2 suppliers, so you selling to somebody else that isn't a major contractor, that's a beautiful way in a lot of procurement opportunities.
And how do you find those opportunities? Last word, and then we'll wrap.
Again, if you were looking for ones in the European Union, I'm saying that because I see a couple of particular questions about that in the Q&A. I would go to the Tender Electronics Daily database in the European Union and look at contract awards. In Canada, I would look under contract awards too. There you will see the price, you will see the company. You have to do some secondary research to learn more about it, but the data is there and it's free.
Fantastic. Any last words, Nadine or Caroline, before we say adieu?
I would just say thank you very much for this opportunity. It's been a great discussion.
Really
Yes, thank
appreciate,
you so much.
really appreciate you making the time. And I think, you know, it's the beginning of a discussion, but while we started with the idea that these two things may be inconsistent, we can see there's been a lot of progress made and huge opportunities. So we'll talk more. Thank you so much.